If a slip of paper flew into your hands during a raging storm, carrying just one line, "You are not forgotten, never," would it be enough to change the rest of your life? That's how Grace, a woman who believed she had become invisible, found hope again and quietly lit up an entire town, one hidden note at a time. Let's discover her extraordinary journey. Welcome to her Fireside Stories. Wishing you a wonderful listening experience. Grace Atwood lived in a small, unassuming town by the name of Willowhaven, a place where the old stone bridge across the creek was still the biggest landmark, and the local diner served the same daily specials it had 30 years ago. She had been a school teacher for most of her life, dedicated to shaping young minds with gentle patience. However, after her retirement, she found that the fullness of her days gradually slipped away, replaced by a hollow quiet she couldn't quite fill. Her husband had passed on 10 years earlier. Her grown children had scattered across the country, and she lived in a modest wooden cottage at the end of a cul-de-sac that rarely saw visitors. She sometimes thought she had become invisible. At the grocery store, people would nod politely but seldom stop for conversation. Former students, once bright-eyed children who had clung to her stories, had moved to larger cities in search of bigger dreams. Even the handful who remained in Willowhaven seemed to have new concerns: mortgages, careers, raising their own children, and had little time to reminisce with their old teacher. As days turned into weeks, she felt that no one sought her advice or even noticed her much anymore. She had never been one for showy displays or social media updates. She preferred handwritten letters over emails, fresh-baked cookies over store-bought gifts. But in an era of digital communication, the gentlewoman found herself increasingly left behind. The town's new families seemed to exist in bubbles of hustle, moving quickly from school drop-offs to soccer practice to late-night grocery runs. Grace would watch them sometimes from her living room window, remembering the robust sense of purpose she felt in front of a classroom. She missed the echo of children's laughter, the hush that fell when a story began, the soft scribble of pencils on paper, and the quietly triumphant grin of a student who finally understood a new concept. In the solitude of her late 60s, she discovered that a life once so consumed by caring for others now left her wandering the house, unsure how to occupy her hours. The highlight of her day became the short walks she took around the neighborhood. She would step onto her porch, lock the front door, and stroll beneath the gentle glow of street lamps. However, these walks took on an even quieter dimension at night. It was in those hushed hours that she would inevitably drift to the very edge of Willowhaven, past the abandoned playground and the old cemetery, to an unassuming chapel that stood beneath twisted oak trees. This chapel had once been a humble place of worship, back when the town had a larger, more devout congregation. Now its windows were cracked, its pews coated with dust, and an eerie silence filled its empty halls. Yet Grace found comfort within its walls. She would sit in the third pew from the front, folding her hands in her lap, neither offering prayers nor expecting any grand revelation, but simply absorbing the profound stillness that enveloped her. She couldn't have said exactly why she gravitated there. Perhaps it was the faint scent of old wood, or the memory of a community that once gathered under this roof. Perhaps it was because that quiet space felt as forgotten as she did. Sometimes she wondered if even God visited here anymore, or if the place was merely a relic, much like an old photograph kept at the bottom of a dusty drawer. Still, she went night after night, a faint figure in a worn coat slipping inside, long after most of Willowhaven had gone to bed. No one ever stopped her. No one asked about her late-night visits. In the timeless hush of that old chapel, Grace could weep unseen if she wanted, or simply breathe and let the lingering echoes of past hymns soothe her. And it was in those moments, right there in that peeling sanctuary, that she felt the smallest hint of belonging in a world that often rushed on without her. One night, as Grace settled into her usual pew, she recalled the final weeks of her teaching career. She had tried to instill more than just facts into her students. She had tried to teach them compassion, wonder, and courage. She remembered that on her last day at Willowhaven Elementary, the children had made a mural of handprints dedicated to Miss Atwood, each print representing a life she had touched. The principal had given a small speech praising her unwavering dedication. Parents had come up to thank her with teary eyes. There were flowers, a plaque, and a promise that the school would never forget her years of service. But the memory stung, for as soon as her nameplate was taken off the classroom door, it was as if those heartfelt moments vanished into the next wave of routine. Each new teacher who arrived had their own methods, their own presence. Life went on as life does, and Grace faded into the background. In the dimly lit chapel, she thought about how roles define us. She had been a teacher. Now she was simply Grace. She was a mentor. Now she was alone. For a while, she clung to volunteer activities, reading to children at the library, helping with local charities. Yet she noticed that people thanked her politely, then moved on with their tasks, often forgetting she was even there. It wasn't that they wished her ill. There was simply no space for her in their hurried schedules. She began to believe that perhaps she had served her purpose, and that now the only tangible comfort left was this chapel with its creaking rafters and chipped altar. She felt a deep, tender ache in her chest whenever she saw a former student who didn't recognize her, or a neighbor who barely managed a lukewarm greeting. Nighttime gave her solace, partly because she didn't have to feign a smile or rush away from stilted small talk. She could walk invisibly under the moon alone with her thoughts. And when she got to the chapel, she could lose herself in the half-dark, letting the hush wrap around her like a well-worn quilt. On this particular night, she noticed the soft glow of a flickering bulb near the far corner of the chapel's ceiling, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The scent of mildew merged with the faint perfume of rain-soaked earth from outside. Despite the place's disrepair, Grace felt a certain kind of peace here, like stepping into a memory. She wasn't a churchgoer in any conventional sense, but she found more comfort in this space than she ever did at formal services. No one was likely to come knocking, and as she sat down, a tear escaped her eye, sliding down her cheek, unbidden. She brushed it away quickly, vaguely embarrassed by her own vulnerability, though she knew no one was around to see. Another bead of moisture clung to her lashes. It might have been another tear, or perhaps the dampness in the air had settled on her face. Closing her eyes, she bowed her head, not to pray exactly, but to listen to the echo of her own heartbeat in the silence. That heartbeat reminded her she was alive, and for a moment being alive felt like enough. And so she stayed there alone but not entirely lonely, resting among the ruins of old worship and old hopes. If only she thought the world outside could slow down just long enough to see her again. Or if not her, then at least the countless others out there like the widower on Maple Street who spoke to no one, or the timid teenage boy who hid in the library after school, people who might also find solace in unvisited corners of the world. What Grace did not yet know was that change often arrives quietly, like a whispered prayer in a dark chapel. And for her, that whisper was about to become something far bigger than she could ever imagine. It happened on one of the stormiest nights of the season. Rain poured from the heavens as if the sky itself had broken open, and ferocious winds rattled old shutters across Willowhaven. Grace, reluctant to miss her nightly visit, pulled on her thickest coat and took an umbrella that flapped wildly under the gusts. Each step felt like a battle against the storm, the wind tugging at her hair and the rain slicing sideways against her cheeks. Water pooled in the sidewalks, forcing her to tiptoe around the edges, and the single street lamp that usually guided her path flickered ominously, casting fleeting shadows that danced like specters. By the time she reached the chapel, the bottom of her coat was soaked through, and her umbrella had nearly turned inside out. She approached the heavy wooden doors, which emitted a low groan as she pushed them open against the wind. The interior was somehow colder than the outside. That night, an unsettling chill that crawled along her arms and settled at the back of her neck. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the howling storm, and took a deep, steadying breath. Lightning flashed through the chapel's broken stained glass window, momentarily illuminating the peeling paint on the walls. Thunder followed, rumbling so powerfully that it seemed to shake the rafters. Grace picked her way down the central aisle, careful of the puddles forming, where the rain dripped through the cracks in the roof. She could feel her heart drumming with each roar of thunder, but she pressed on, determined to find her usual seat. Then, as she settled into the pew, a sudden gust of wind blew through a broken pane in the chapel's ancient window. The wind carried with it a small slip of paper, sending it fluttering through the air until it landed by her feet. It was so unexpected that for a moment, Grace simply stared at it, thinking it was perhaps some scrap of a church bulletin or a lost receipt. Yet something about the paper tugged at her curiosity. Leaning down, she picked it up. Raindrops glistened on its surface, and in the dim light, she could make out words printed in neat, bold letters. Those words read, "You are not forgotten." Never. Beneath the sentence was a faint imprint of a papal insignia, as if it had once been part of a sermon or a church program from many years ago. Grace felt a jolt, a strange warmth that surged through her, battling the chill of the night. She read the line again and again, "You are not forgotten, never." It was so simple, yet its impact on her was monumental. She had felt invisible for so long, and here in her sanctuary of solitude came these words as if carried by fate itself. The wind had delivered them, or maybe it was something more. Thunder boomed again, jolting her from her reverie. Clutching the paper, Grace pressed it gently against her chest. A sob rose in her throat, and she found herself weeping in the dim glow of the chapel's lone bulb. She sobbed for the sense of invisibility that had weighed on her heart for years, for the memories of the classroom she missed so much, for the neighbors who never truly saw her. Mostly she cried because for the first time in a long while, she felt acknowledged. The storm raged on outside, but inside, Grace felt an unexpected stillness blossoming within her soul. And though she was entirely alone in that chapel in that instant, she truly believed she was not forgotten. Tears coursed down Grace's cheeks, mingling with the rain that still clung to her face. She hadn't cried like that in years. Over time, her emotions had hardened into a quiet resolve. She had become adept at stifling her sadness with gentle smiles and mild nods. The world had never asked for her tears, and so she had learned not to offer them, but tonight was different. The simple act of reading those words, "You are not forgotten, never," unlocked something within her, releasing the pent-up sorrow, longing, and strangely enough, gratitude. She wondered about the origin of this slip of paper. Was it part of a sermon once delivered by a traveling priest or bishop? Had it been torn from an old book of homilies? The small papal insignia hinted at some official document, yet the message felt timeless and personal. And how curious that it would find its way to her on such a tumultuous night, carried on the breath of a windstorm. She couldn't dismiss it as mere coincidence. It felt like a sign perhaps not from heaven, but from the shared spirit of humanity, reminding her that even when she felt alone, she was connected to others in ways she couldn't fully understand. Somewhere in the world, someone cared enough to print those words. Perhaps that unknown figure also grappled with feelings of invisibility or heartbreak. Suddenly, she sensed a kinship with all who read or wrote such messages, a quiet bond that transcended time and place. In that moment of raw vulnerability, the chapel did not merely feel like an abandoned relic. It felt like a container for hope, however small and battered it might be. Grace read the words once more. A gentle smile trembled across her lips, and she slipped the paper into her coat pocket as if it were a rare gemstone she intended to cherish. She inhaled, steadying herself, and noticed that her tears had slowed. Her heartbeat, which had been hammering minutes earlier, began to calm. The howling winds outside persisted, but the flickering bulb overhead seemed less menacing and more comforting, like a solitary lighthouse in the midst of a raging sea. Eventually, she gathered the strength to rise from her pew. She still felt unsteady, as though the intensity of her emotions had drained her. Clutching the slip of paper, she navigated back up the aisle toward the chapel doors. The storm still raged, but her spirit felt unexpectedly lighter. Stepping outside, she lifted her umbrella, a flimsy shield but enough to guide her back home. The walk was still treacherous. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the soaked streets, and thunder cracked like a giant's whip. Yet each time the wind surged against her, she placed a hand over the note in her pocket, and a soft warmth radiated through her chest. By the time she arrived at her little cottage, puddles had become pools, and the gutters overflowed with the night's relentless downpour. She peeled off her dripping coat and hung it carefully, making sure the precious slip of paper was safe. In the quiet confines of her home, she gently spread the note out on a small table, letting it dry in the light of a flickering lamp. She stared at those words. "You are not forgotten." Never, and felt them echo through the silence. For a woman who had believed herself to be a mere afterthought, it was a balm that soothed wounds she hadn't realized were so deep. And though she didn't quite understand why or how, yet in her heart she began to sense a calling, a soft beckoning whisper of possibility that would soon change her life and her entire town in ways she never saw coming. Grace woke the next morning with an unusual sense of anticipation. She reached for the dried piece of paper on her bedside table, reading the words anew. "You are not forgotten." Never recalling the swell of emotion she'd felt in the chapel, she realized something profound. This modest, almost accidental message had given her a glimmer of genuine hope. It made her reflect on how many people out there were stumbling through their own storms, emotional or otherwise, feeling overlooked or unimportant. If one line on a rain-stained piece of paper could rekindle her spirit, perhaps she could do the same for someone else. Inspired, she rummaged through her dusty old desk drawers, searching for something to write on. Eventually, she found a stack of unused stationery, mostly blank index cards and little scraps left from her teaching days. She laid them out on the kitchen table, her mind spinning with possibilities. During her teaching years, she had often written uplifting notes to students who struggled, short words of encouragement like, "Believe in your abilities," or "You have a bright future." Now the memory of those small gestures guided her hand. She picked up a pen, its ink slightly dried from disuse, and began writing. At first, her notes were just a few words each. "You matter, keep your light shining. Hope is never far. Your kindness makes a difference." She wrote them carefully, reflecting on how a brief message could spark warmth in a tired soul. She remembered the small sermon fragment she'd found. Though she wasn't the Pope, or even a particularly religious person, she could harness the same kindness and direct it outward. Once she had a small stack of these notes, she considered how to distribute them. She felt a flutter of nervous excitement. The idea of stepping into someone else's life anonymously thrilled her in a quiet, purposeful way. She envisioned the surprise and wonder a stranger might feel upon finding a note tucked in a jacket pocket or hidden in a library book. The notion felt mischievous and tender all at once, like planting little seeds of hope around town, trusting they would sprout in unsuspecting hearts. Over the following days, Grace refined her technique. She would slip out of her house in the early morning or late evening, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. She'd leave a note inside a shopping cart at the local grocery store, tucking it under the corner of the plastic seat. She'd fold one into the pages of a random book at the library, or slide another into the pocket of a coat at the thrift shop. Sometimes she'd even wait near the park, watching from a distance as a passerby discovered one of her messages. Each time she saw someone pause, pick up the note, and read it, her heart swelled. She knew she was walking a delicate line between kindness and intrusion, but the sincerity of her motives gave her courage. The first time she saw a young mother reach into a cart and retrieve the tiny paper, she watched the woman's face change from distracted exhaustion to amused curiosity. Then came a faint smile. That fleeting expression was all the validation Grace needed. It was proof that her small acts had the power to lift someone's spirits, if only for a moment. In the evenings, Grace continued her visits to the chapel. She would sit in the dim light with her pen and scraps of paper, composing new messages that came to her mind. Small affirmations, wishes of strength, and reminders that no one should feel alone in a community meant to uplift one another. The once forgotten pew became her desk, the gentle hush her companion. A swirl of emotions always filled her, the lingering loneliness, the fervent hope, and the cautious thrill that came with each new note she prepared. Some messages were practical. It's okay to ask for help. Others were more spiritual or philosophical. Stars shine brightest in the dark. She began to get bolder, writing slightly longer notes about resilience, courage, or compassion. She even quoted lines of poetry she remembered teaching in class, such as Robert Frost's. "In 3 words, I can sum up everything I've learned about life. It goes on." The variety of messages reflected the spectrum of human emotion she'd witnessed throughout her teaching years. She tried to imagine who might find each note. Perhaps a stressed single father juggling 2 jobs and childcare. Perhaps a teenager overwhelmed by exams who felt like failure was imminent. Or maybe an older person like herself navigating loneliness in a small town where the lights turned off early and people seldom knocked on your door. Whoever they were, she prayed that her words might reassure them for one precious second in an otherwise crowded day. To keep her efforts secret, Grace developed a routine. She'd place a few notes in her coat pocket and venture out under the cover of dusk or dawn, carefully selecting spots where townsfolk might stumble upon them. She even experimented with leaving notes near the bus stop, slipping them into the space between the bench slats. She'd greet acquaintances casually if they passed by, making idle chatter about the weather or the local news. Nothing to suggest she was the mysterious note fairy, as she sometimes jokingly called herself. In her own head, a part of her felt a childlike glee at the secrecy. It was reminiscent of hiding Easter eggs for children and then watching their faces light up as they discovered something unexpected. The difference was that these notes were for everyone, young or old, and the joy was deeper, laced with empathy and understanding of hardship. She was planting intangible seeds of hope, trusting the wind to scatter them where they were needed most. Yet there was a vulnerability to it, too. Each time she penned a note, she poured a bit of her heart onto the page. She shared words she'd once desperately needed for herself, messages she wished someone had handed her at her lowest. In sending them out into the world, she felt exposed, as though she were whispering her innermost feelings to strangers. But that vulnerability felt liberating as well. It was as if she were forging a bond with anyone who cared to listen, a quiet reminder that empathy can bridge even the widest gap of solitude. And so she kept writing night after night, determined that her discovery in the storm-ravaged chapel would not remain a solitary blessing, but a light she could pass on to others who also wandered in the dark. Within a few weeks, whispers began circulating around Willow Haven about mysterious messages of encouragement turning up in the most unexpected places. A teenage girl named Lily stumbled across a note nestled between the pages of a novel she'd checked out from the public library. She had been returning the book when the slip of paper fell out into her lap. It read, "You have a story inside you worth telling," signed by no one, addressed to no one. Lily's heart soared. She'd been wrestling with severe self-doubt regarding a short story contest, convinced she wasn't talented enough to enter. but the message gave her the spark she needed. That very night, she sat down at her desk, sharpened her pencils, and began writing with renewed determination. A few days later, a local mechanic named Thomas discovered a note stuck to the inside of his jacket pocket. He almost missed it, but while patting his pockets for a pen, he found a small slip of paper that read, "Never forget why you started." This simple prompt resonated powerfully. Thomas had recently considered shutting down his father's old repair shop, believing it was too outdated to compete with modern service centers. But the note made him recall the reason he had taken over the shop in the first place: his father's legacy, his own love for machines, and the satisfaction of solving mechanical puzzles. Instead of giving up, he decided to modernize in small steps, installing new equipment and reaching out to customers on social media for the first time. The local cafe became another hotspot for these hidden messages. Waitresses reported customers discussing folded scraps of paper they'd discovered on tables or tucked under their napkins. Some quietly pocketed them, others read them aloud to their companions. Over cups of coffee and slices of pie, people speculated about the identity of the anonymous note writer. A few posited it was a local pastor, though most churches in Willow Haven had only small congregations. Others joked that it might be a traveling angel or one of the older folks in town with too much time on their hands. In the hush of these everyday moments, a small but noticeable ripple spread through the community. People began to pay attention to the little details in their daily routines, checking pockets they rarely used, flipping through pages of free newspapers stacked at the diner, even glancing under their windshield wipers before driving away. An undercurrent of anticipation formed, the sense that something kind and reassuring might be waiting for them at any turn. It was as if Willow Haven itself leaned forward, ears perked, waiting for the next note to appear. Grace, watching quietly from the sidelines, felt a mixture of pride and relief. She had worried that her efforts would go unseen or that people might dismiss the messages as an odd prank. But as stories trickled back of the girl inspired to enter a contest of the mechanic reviving his father's shop, she realized the power of even the smallest gestures of kindness. She continued her nightly routine, crafting new notes with different words of inspiration and sprinkling them around town like breadcrumbs of hope. And as the town buzzed with speculation, she savored the anonymity. It wasn't about receiving credit. It was about reminding people of their worth, just as she had once been reminded by that single life-altering slip of paper in the chapel. Grace's journey reminds us how a single kind word can spark transformation. If you've been enjoying the story so far, don't hesitate to share your thoughts or let others know about it. Who knows, your voice might be the encouragement someone else needs today. Now let's return to Willow Haven and see what happens next. At the Willow Haven Elementary School, the children too felt the ripples of these secret messages. Though Grace had retired, she still passed by the old building, at times leaving a note in the small flower bed near the entrance or on the underside of a lost and found jacket. A staff member discovered one tucked inside a box of donated clothes for needy families. Another was found by a student rummaging through the coat rack. Before long, the teachers overheard students talking excitedly about hope notes and how lucky they felt if they found one. One chilly morning, 8-year-old Ava pressed a rumpled slip of paper to her heart on the playground. The note had said, "You are braver than you think." Over the previous weeks, Ava had been terrified of her turn at the school's talent show, afraid she'd forget her lines while reading a poem. She confided in her best friend about the note, and the two giggled with awe, speculating about who might be leaving these little gems around the school. Spurred by the message, Ava decided she would practice her poem relentlessly until she could recite it in her sleep. There was something magical about the atmosphere in those hallways. Teachers reported a slight but noticeable decrease in playground squabbles. Students seemed more inclined to exchange kind words, as if they too wanted to be part of the benevolent energy weaving its way through the school. It was as though each newly discovered note reminded them that compassion and bravery weren't just words in a dictionary. They were actions they could perform every day. At the local library, librarians noticed more people turning up in the reading corners, flipping through books carefully, perhaps hoping to find a note of their own. Teenagers came in clusters, giggling as they whispered about the message. Mania senior citizens lingered longer than usual, wandering between shelves in search of these hidden tokens of kindness. Newcomers to Willow Haven, who might otherwise feel out of place in a tightly knit small town, found themselves drawn into conversations when they too stumbled upon a note. "It's like a treasure hunt," one woman exclaimed, "but the treasure is a few kind words that make your day a little brighter." Rumors abounded about who the letter sender might be. Some believed it could be a church group handing out messages of hope. Others speculated about a philanthropic organization, and still more assumed it was a local parent or retired teacher with a heart for community service. A few cynics rolled their eyes at the hype. How important could a small piece of paper be after all? But even the cynics softened when they found a note addressed seemingly to the exact fear or insecurity that plagued them. The improbable serendipity tugged at their disbelief, leaving them momentarily speechless as more notes found their way into pockets, lockers, and returned library books. A subtle shift occurred in Willow Haven's collective mood. Neighbors started greeting each other more warmly. Local businesses saw an uptick in friendly interactions, and even the somewhat gruff store clerks managed more genuine smiles. It was as if a gentle wind of kindness had blown over the town, carrying Grace's handwritten whispers to corners she never imagined. And in the midst of all this unfolding magic, Grace felt a spark of renewal in her own life, a sense of belonging she had feared lost forever. Soon, the local newspaper, a thin weekly publication named the Willow Haven Gazette, ran a short article about the phenomenon. In bold letters across the top of page 3, it read, "Who is the invisible letter sender?" The piece chronicled the discovery of various notes across town, sharing anecdotes of how these tiny scraps of encouragement had found their way into folks' daily routines. The journalist who wrote it, Paula Monroe, interviewed several residents. One mother recounted how her anxious teenage daughter stumbled upon a message that read, "Your anxiety does not define you," and how it became a mantra that helped the girl face exams without panicking. Another man described finding a note telling him to keep moving forward, which he read the same day he lost his job. Rather than spiral into despair, he took it as a sign to persevere. Paula's article concluded with a call for anyone who knew the identity of the letter sender to come forward. She urged readers to submit their stories of how the notes had impacted them, promising to compile a follow-up feature. Over the next week, the Gazette office received an unprecedented wave of letters and emails, some from people simply expressing gratitude, others sharing deeply personal stories of renewed hope or courage. A surprising number came from outside Willow Haven, forwarded by friends or family who had heard about the mystery and wanted to weigh in. It appeared Grace's small act of kindness was garnering attention beyond the little town's borders. Those letters ranged from lighthearted to heartbreaking. One mentioned a father battling depression who found a note in his jacket pocket just before heading out to see a counselor for the first time. The message was, "Don't be ashamed to heal." Another came from a college student who lived miles away but had visited Willow Haven briefly for a wedding. She discovered a note in the local hotel's Bible reading corner. "Your journey is your own walk." It boldly. The student, uncertain about her major and future career, claimed the note's timing was spookily perfect and gave her the nudge to pursue a passion she'd been neglecting. In just a few short weeks, the invisible letter sender became somewhat of a local legend. Everyone wanted to find a note. Everyone had a theory about who might be writing them. Some speculated it was a group effort, perhaps orchestrated by the local youth group, or a secret philanthropic club. Others swore it must be one of Willow Haven's elders who remembered old-fashioned ways of connecting with people. A handful of wild theories circulated that the notes were part of a sociological experiment or even a viral marketing scheme. Despite all the speculation, Grace carried on in her usual modest way. She read the Gazette article with a soft smile, but took care not to let her excitement show too openly in public. After all, she valued the anonymity that gave her the freedom to continue her mission without pressure or expectation. She still visited the chapel almost every night, letting the quiet environment cradle her thoughts as she dreamed up new messages. A small lamp and the faint glow of moonlight were all she needed to work by, and the gentle hum of crickets outside felt like a comforting lullaby. In that sacred space, she considered the ripple effect of her actions. Had she ever predicted such a large response? Certainly not. She was only one person inspired by a single note that had landed at her feet on a stormy night. But she had discovered something profound, a reminder for herself and others that hope can be both delicate and unstoppable. Once planted, it grows in the most unlikely cracks, illuminating hearts that might otherwise remain in shadow. As the invisible letter phenomenon grew, certain townspeople took it upon themselves to send letters of appreciation to the Gazette addressed to the mystery note writer. They thanked them for making Willow Haven a friendlier place and encouraged them to keep going. Some of these letters were published in the newspaper's Letters to the Editor section, forming a mosaic of gratitude. Your small notes changed my daily routine. Now, every morning, instead of dreading work, I look for little reminders that people care. I have never felt so connected to our community. I used to think we were all drifting apart, but these notes remind me that empathy still exists. To whoever you are, thank you for reminding me that kindness is not dead. I had almost lost faith. The children of Willow Haven Elementary were especially enthralled. Spurred by the excitement, a group of fourth graders formed what they called the Club of Hope Notes. They met during recess in a secluded corner of the playground, sharing tales of any new notes they found and plotting elaborate scavenger hunts around town. Their teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, caught wind of their activities and gently supervised, pleased to see their imagination sparked by something so positively charged. One of the children, a bright-eyed boy named Milo, showed up with a handcrafted binder to store any notes they recovered. Soon the binder was filled with scraps of paper, featuring various uplifting messages, each treasured as though it were a relic from a beloved storybook. Grace observed these developments from a distance, her heart warmed by the idea of children uniting over messages of hope. She remembered all too well how fragile confidence could be at that age and how easily discouragement could take root. The idea that her notes might encourage a child to see the world in a more positive light was enough motivation to continue her nocturnal missions. Yet with the growing public curiosity, Grace had to be cautious. She found herself developing new strategies to stay hidden, wearing a scarf that concealed part of her face, choosing times when fewer people were around and selecting varied locations to deposit her notes. She also switched up her handwriting style, occasionally adding subtle flourishes or changing her pen color to throw off potential sleuths. It amused her how something born from pure altruism could feel so thrillingly clandestine. While the notes had taken on a life of their own, Grace's own life also began to shift in subtle ways. Neighbors who once offered her perfunctory greetings started waving more enthusiastically. She couldn't help but suspect they were under the influence of the warmer atmosphere spreading across Willow Haven. A cashier at the grocery store who had never said more than 2 words to her struck up a conversation about the latest note rumor. Even though Grace had to feign ignorance, she couldn't deny the pleasure of an extended chat, something that rarely happened before. And so even as the town collectively hunted for the identity of the invisible letter sender, Grace felt herself stepping out of the shadows in a different sense. Her spirit, once resigned to invisibility, began blossoming in sync with the community she'd chosen to uplift. For all the secrecy and subterfuge, a quiet wave of pride and belonging washed over her, letting her know she too was part of something that mattered. Amid the growing excitement, however, Grace couldn't entirely quell the seeds of self-doubt sprouting inside her. By nature, she had always been modest, even shy about her personal achievements. Now her clandestine project was becoming the talk of the town. On one hand, she felt elated to see such a positive transformation. On the other, she feared being exposed. More than that, she worried about whether she was overstepping boundaries, inadvertently making herself a hidden focal point of people's hopes and longings. She often asked herself, "Am I doing too much?" Late at night, sitting at her kitchen table, under the soft glow of an antique lamp, she would stare at a freshly written stack of notes. She'd replay in her mind the small, candid interviews she'd overheard residents telling the cafe owner or the librarian how much these messages meant to them. Sometimes a pang of guilt shot through her. Who was she to meddle in others' emotional lives? What if someone found her note at the wrong time or misread the message? The weight of that possibility pressed heavily on her conscience. Yet each time she ventured into doubt, she remembered that very first slip of paper that had found her on that stormy night in the chapel. Those words, "You are not forgotten," never had come to her at a moment of desperation. They had pulled her from the silent despair of invisibility. If something so small could save her from a downward spiral, then why deny others the chance to experience that same gentle nudge toward hope? Still, the attention unsettled her. She noticed a handful of inquisitive souls watching more closely for any sign of who might be planting the notes around town. One evening, as she discreetly slipped a note into a coat pocket near the entrance of the grocery store, she glanced up to see a man named Oliver, a local reporter, eyeing her with mild suspicion. His gaze flitted from her hand to the pocket, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. She quickly pretended to search her own coat pocket for some item, feigning confusion as she patted her sides and walked away. She could sense him hesitating, uncertain whether he had seen something significant or just an odd quirk of an old woman. Back home, Grace's sleep became restless. She had always relished her privacy, and the idea of being unmasked made her uneasy. She feared the scrutiny her motives questioned her quiet life, thrust under a spotlight. Moreover, she was not entirely sure if she could handle the responsibility of being identified as the source of these messages, especially if anyone criticized or dismissed her efforts. The thought of being ridiculed or worse accused of orchestrating some elaborate hoax rattled her. During her nightly visits to the chapel, she prayed in her own non-traditional way, simply asking for clarity. On one such night, a light drizzle tapped against the broken window panes, creating a soft percussion that lulled her into reflection. She thought about how the notes had enriched her life, giving her renewed purpose. In them, she had found a way to be part of a community that once made her feel invisible. Perhaps she could trust that the good she was doing outweighed the risks. If people were kinder, if the lonely felt seen, if a discouraged soul found reason to hold on, wasn't that worth a bit of personal discomfort? And so she resolved to continue, albeit more cautiously, driven by the conviction that an act of love was seldom wasted. Despite her lingering fears, a quiet determination blossomed within Grace. She reflected on how even in her teaching days, she had always strived to be more than just a dispenser of knowledge. She wanted to be a nurturer of spirits. Back then, she had found subtle ways to encourage her students, leaving sticky notes on their desks that read, "You're doing great," or "Never let mistakes stop you from learning." This new chapter of her life felt like an evolution of that same calling. Of course, the secrecy made it more exhilarating, but it was also a testament to her humility. She didn't need a pat on the back or a newspaper profile celebrating her efforts. She wanted the focus to remain on the words themselves, on their ability to connect with a person's sense of hope. And though a corner of her heart ached for true connection, someone she could laugh or share a meal with, she realized that her notes were forging deep, if anonymous, bonds across the town. As more thank you letters poured into the Gazette, the sense of shared wonder in Willow Haven reached a new peak. A councilman proposed that the town host a small festival celebrating community kindness, hoping to draw in visitors and reinforce Willow Haven's image as a warm, welcoming place. Flyers began to appear on telephone poles and in shop windows announcing Hope Fest, a day of gratitude, inviting everyone to gather in the town square for music, food, and stories of inspiration. Though it wasn't explicitly about the invisible letter sender, it was clear the festival was meant to honor the spirit of hope those notes had ignited. Grace's anxiety spiked upon learning of the festival. Would it give people more reason to search for her identity? She felt torn between pride that the town was coming together, partly because of her quiet campaign, and dread that someone might corner her with questions she wasn't prepared to answer. During one particularly reflective evening at the chapel, she brought a small candle. Lighting it with trembling hands, she stared into the flame, watching it flicker and dance. The candle reminded her of the fragility of light, how easily it could be snuffed out by a careless breath. Yet it also illuminated the darkness with unwavering persistence, however small it was. She felt a kinship with that flame, recognizing that though her own contributions might be fragile, they nevertheless cast a meaningful glow in many lives. In the end, her love for the townspeople triumphed over her trepidation. She decided she would continue writing notes, festival or no festival. If the day came when her identity was revealed, she would face it with the same grace she had tried to instill in her students. Until then, she would trust in the kindness of her neighbors and the fundamental decency of a community that had already shown itself capable of warmth and gratitude. The risk of personal exposure seemed a fair trade for the blossoming hope she saw in Willow Haven's newly radiant smiles. The day after Grace solidified her resolve, she walked into the local supermarket Evelyn's Grocers, a family-owned shop with slightly cramped aisles and the friendliest produce manager you'd ever meet. She planned to leave a note in the coat pocket of a woman she'd noticed earlier, who looked especially tired, juggling a toddler on one hip and a grocery list in the other hand. Her face bore that weariness born not of a single sleepless night, but a season of strained responsibilities. Grace had quietly observed how the woman absent-mindedly sighed while scanning shelves for cereal, as if she carried the weight of the world in her shopping cart. Grace timed her move carefully. Once she saw the woman step away from her coat, which hung over the handle of the cart, Grace sidled up as though she were examining a display of canned vegetables. A flutter of nerves danced in her stomach. She still wasn't used to these covert maneuvers in broad daylight. Heart thumping, she slipped a small folded note into the coat's front pocket. It said, "Your strength is beautiful. Don't forget to rest." Just as she was about to retreat, Grace sensed movement behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, and there stood a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, bright-eyed with curiosity. The girl was looking straight at Grace's hand as it exited the coat pocket. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, Grace felt she'd been entirely exposed. The child wore a quizzical expression, and Grace realized this must be the woman's daughter. Time seemed to slow. 1,000 thoughts collided in Grace's mind. Should she smile? Should she explain? Should she pretend she was mistaken about the coat? Her cheeks burned, and the child stared with innocent curiosity, clearly aware that something unusual was happening. Then, surprising Grace, the girl offered a shy, gentle smile, as if she understood this was a good secret, not a bad one. Slowly, she put her index finger to her lips in the universal gesture. For silence, Grace felt tears welling behind her eyes. That one small motion spoke volumes. The girl wasn't about to alert her mother or anyone else. In that silent exchange, it was as if the child sensed the kindness behind Grace's action and chose to become an unwitting accomplice. She nodded to Grace almost imperceptibly, as if granting permission for the act to continue. Then, with the stealth of a spy, she turned back to her mother, who was comparing prices on different brands of cereal. Grace exhaled relief and gratitude swirling within her. She gently patted the little girl's shoulder, a fleeting gesture of thanks, before retreating down another aisle, her heart pounding like a drum. In that moment, she grasped the truth that her secrecy, though important, was not the central point. The real power lay in the compassion fueling her actions, and the child in her innocent wisdom had offered the simplest kind of validation, a knowing smile, a finger to the lips. Outside, the sky was a crisp blue, dotted with a few puffy clouds, as if hinting at the clarity Grace felt in her own soul. She walked home, the sound of her own footsteps oddly comforting against the sidewalk. Though her heart was still beating fast from the near discovery, she felt more sure than ever that she was on the right path. Someone out there had seen her act, and rather than condemn her, they had silently joined her cause. It was the smallest pact, but it encapsulated the spirit of what she'd been doing all along, exchanging fear for empathy, loneliness for connection, and anonymity for a shared sense of hope. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, Grace couldn't stop thinking about the little girl's smile. She brewed herself a pot of chamomile tea, hoping to calm the jittery feeling in her nerves. Yet underneath her lingering adrenaline lay a deep contentment. She realized she had stopped measuring her life in terms of how lonely or forgotten she felt. Instead, she measured it by the potential for connection she brought into the world, even if she did so behind the scenes. She allowed herself a moment to envision what might happen if the mother discovered the note Grace had placed in her coat pocket. Perhaps she'd come across it that very evening while hanging her coat up at home, or maybe the next day when she slipped her hand inside the pocket, absent-mindedly. Would the mother smile? Would she hold the note close to her heart, the way Grace once did with the papal message she'd found in the chapel? And what about the little girl? Would she keep the secret to herself, or eventually share it with her mother in a burst of excitement? Maybe, just maybe, they'd both be touched by a sense of wonder. The thought warmed Grace more than the tea. She felt a stirring of optimism that was new and profound. It was as if each note she left behind was also leaving behind a fragment of her own loneliness, replaced by a small spark of hope. And she saw that same spark reflected in the townspeople, particularly the children whose eyes shone a bit brighter since the arrival of the mysterious messages. Yet she was no fool. She knew the possibility of being found out loomed around every corner. The upcoming Hope Fest only increased the likelihood that the town would intensify its search for the letter writer. Rumors circulated that Oliver, the local reporter, was determined to solve the mystery before the festival, possibly even writing an exposé for the Gazette. Grace wasn't angry at him. She understood the appeal of a compelling story in a small town, but she worried that exposure might overshadow the simple act of kindness that started it all. The notes weren't about her. They were about a universal longing to feel seen and valued. As she finished her tea, she gazed at the small pile of notes waiting on the table. Tonight's messages read, "You are enough just as you are. The sun will rise again and embrace the small joys." She planned to distribute them in the library, the bus station, and the post office lobby. Tomorrow, she'd pen fresh ones for the senior center and the community garden. With each note, she whispered a silent wish that the recipient would experience the same wave of relief and affirmation she once felt when she first read, "You are not forgotten." Never before bed, she paused by the window, looking out at the moonlit street. The child in the supermarket and her protective little gesture lingered in Grace's mind. It was a reminder that even when you least expect it, someone is ready to meet your kindness with kindness of their own. If secrecy was a form of solitude, she realized it was one she no longer felt burdened by. because even that silent cloak was woven from threads of compassion and understanding. Is there a moment in this story that resonates with your own experiences? I'd love to hear your thoughts or see you share this with someone who might need a touch of hope. Every voice matters in keeping this gentle wave of kindness going. Let's continue. Aimis an anisiyuen taesum. As the day of Hope Fest approached, Willowhaven bustled with preparation. Strings of colorful lights were hung across Main Street and small banners appeared in shop windows, each adorned with heartwarming quotes, some from famous authors, others from the notes that had become so iconic in town. The excitement was palpable. People whispered in anticipation, curious if the invisible letter sender would make an appearance. Live music was scheduled for the main stage. Local restaurants were offering special dishes, and families planned a day out to celebrate the community spirit that had flourished in recent months. Grace watched from a distance, admiring the vibrant shift in the town she had once found so isolating. Though she remained cautious, she also felt a growing sense of peace. Even if her identity were uncovered, the real story here wasn't about her. It was about an entire community learning to care more deeply for one another, sparked by small notes of kindness. She decided she would attend Hope Fest, not to reveal herself, but to witness the culmination of all those seeds she had sown. On the morning of the festival, she dressed in a soft lavender sweater and a comfortable pair of slacks. Nothing too eye-catching. She arrived early, blending into the crowd that milled around the town square. Booths were being set up selling homemade crafts and baked goods. Children ran about balloons in hand, their laughter filling the air with a festive joy. A makeshift stage stood at one end of the square where local musicians tested their instruments. Wandering through the booths, Grace overheard a snippet of conversation between two elderly women. "Have you found a note yet?" one asked. "Oh, yes," the other replied. "I found one in my mailbox last week. It said, 'Your kindness has a ripple effect.' And you know what? I started writing short letters to my grandchildren every weekend because of it." Grace smiled behind the brim of her hat, resisting the urge to reveal that she was the one who wrote the note. Nearby, a young couple talked about how the messages had prompted them to volunteer more, helping at the local soup kitchen and after-school programs. Everywhere she turned, she noticed bright faces, each bearing a hint of that renewed communal warmth. When she reached the main stage, she found a seat near the back, partly hidden by a small group of teenagers. The mayor, an affable man named Frederick, took the microphone and welcomed everyone to the first annual Hope Fest. He spoke about the transformation Willowhaven had undergone, attributing much of the new optimism to the unexpected arrival of these encouraging notes. While he acknowledged they still didn't know who was responsible, he led the crowd in a round of applause for the mystery letter sender. Whomever they might be, Grace felt her cheeks grow hot, and she joined the applause politely, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and embarrassment. As the applause died down, Frederick read out a few of the notes that had resonated most with residents. One by one, he recited, "Never let fear block your path. Mistakes are merely stepping stones. You have more courage than you realize." With each phrase, the crowd murmured in recognition, some nodding, others smiling, as though recalling the moment they first encountered such words. Then a hush fell. Frederick concluded, "These small messages reminded us all to be kinder, not only to each other, but to ourselves." Today, we celebrate the spirit of hope that lives in Willowhaven and beyond. The crowd erupted in cheers and clapping once more, children jumping in excitement, older folks wiping tears from their eyes. In that moment, watching faces lit with gratitude, Grace sensed a quiet satisfaction that transcended any fear of discovery. Even if someone pointed at her right then and said, "It's you," she felt ready to own what she had done. She understood at last that the notes had become something much bigger than her personal quest. They belonged to everyone who found joy, solace, or courage in them, and that collective ownership meant the hope would endure, even if someday Grace herself ceased to write. The festival carried on with music, laughter, and an outpouring of friendly conversation. As twilight approached, the strings of lights overhead twinkled like low-hanging stars, and the crowd gradually thinned. Grace wandered to a quieter corner of the square, finding a small wooden bench under a towering oak. She observed families packing up picnic blankets, teenagers drifting off to after parties, and seniors leisurely strolling, soaking up the evening's pleasant breeze. Her gaze fell upon a group of children playing tag near the edge of the park. Among them, she recognized Milo, the boy who led the Club of Hope Notes at Willow Haven Elementary. He spotted Grace and, in a spontaneous burst of friendliness, waved and ran over. They'd never officially met, but Grace suspected he might have seen her around the school in her retirement visits or glimpsed her dropping notes here and there. His enthusiasm was clear. "Hi." Milo greeted, a little breathless from running. "Did you hear about the notes everyone is talking about? Isn't it cool?" Grace smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I did hear something about that." "Yes. Quite the mystery, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said, grinning. "My friends and I found a bunch of them. We keep them in a binder. We call it our treasure book." He paused, glancing at Grace with a mischievous light in his eyes. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" She felt her heart skip a beat, but Milo's tone was playful, not accusatory. She only shook her head in gentle denial. "I've just heard stories same as you," she replied softly. "But it's wonderful to see everyone so happy, isn't it?" Milo nodded, looking momentarily thoughtful. "I guess we don't really need to know who's writing them," he said. "It's more like they help people and that's enough, right?" Grace felt a lump forming in her throat. "Right," she managed to say. "That's exactly it." Satisfied, Milo gave her a wide grin and dashed back to his friends, the innocence of his question swirling into the evening air. Grace breathed out slowly, feeling as though she had just navigated a delicate dance. Yet Milo's words affirmed something she already suspected: the identity of the note writer no longer mattered. What mattered was the kindness shared and the hope it ignited. Her thoughts drifted to the future. She was aging, her hair now a soft silver, and her knees sometimes ached in damp weather. She couldn't continue this secret mission forever, but maybe the seeds she had planted would grow in others. Perhaps in a few years, the town wouldn't need a single invisible sender because neighbors would be looking out for each other without prompting. Maybe notes would continue to appear penned by different hands, each carrying forward the legacy of small, loving gestures. In her mind's eye, Grace saw a time beyond her own life where a young boy in a playground discovered a message of encouragement hidden under a slide left by another person who had once been touched by Grace's original notes. The cycle would go on, she realized, because hope is contagious. It lives on in every heart that refuses to let darkness win. She stood from the bench and began her walk home, the glow of the festival lights behind her and the gentle hush of the night ahead. With each step, she felt lighter, as though the entire journey from a lonely teacher seeking solitude in an abandoned chapel to an anonymous messenger lighting up people's lives had been leading her here to this calm acceptance. And so the whispers in Willow Haven continued long after Hope Fest ended. Even as the decorations were taken down and the stage dismantled, new notes kept appearing, some from Grace, some from those inspired by her. The old chapel still welcomed her nightly visits, each time offering a silent space for reflection. And on a particularly crisp morning, years later, a young boy found a fresh note near the playground swing set. Unfolding it, he read words that warmed his heart, a gentle reminder of the timeless message passed down through acts of compassion. "You are not forgotten. Never the end." Thank you for listening to tonight's heartfelt tale on her Fireside Stories. Grace's quiet courage and kindness remind us all that no act of compassion is ever too small, and that hope can thrive even in the loneliest of hearts. I hope her story inspired you, made you smile, or perhaps encouraged you to spread a little kindness of your own. If you enjoyed this tale, please leave a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts. Did any part of Grace's journey resonate with your own experiences? And remember, if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications for more emotional and uplifting stories each week. Until next time, keep listening, keep believing, and keep sharing your warmth with the world.